Welcome to Nomad PHP Lightning Talks. I'm Joe Ferguson. Nomad PHP Lightning Talks are 10-minute talks that give a high-level overview or an in-depth look at a small portion of a PHP-related topic. Lightning Talks are a great way for speakers to build their speaking resume or for long-time speakers to test drive a new talk idea. If you'd like to give a 10-minute lightning talk, please email me, joe@nomadphp.com. Right now we have Ben Smith, and he's going to be talking about config is not code, how to use environment variables in PHP. After the talk, make sure you leave Ben some feedback on JoinDem. Let him know what he could do better and what he did right. Ben, take it away. I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Joe. So today we're going to talk about config is not code and how to use environment variables in PHP. I'm going to give a lightning introduction here. I am one of many Benjamin Smiths on Twitter. I also have more than one blog post at benjaminsmith.com if you want to check that out. I am a technical lead here in New York City at a company called Vector Media Group. We do tons and tons of PHP work, and I know some other people I work with have done some lightning talk before. So I'm going to jump right into it here. I want to start with what we don't do when we're configuring our PHP applications. I am guilty of doing this many, many times, and this code I'm showing you on the right here is stuff is actually in production right now. We haven't fixed this up, but basically, a lot of you may have recognized this pattern of basically having a big switch block against a host server variable, which is by your Nginx or whatever web server you have, and basically taking that host and defining an environment kind of global, which you can use throughout your application. So we know, hey, we're in a local environment, or in the QA environment, we're in the production environment, and you basically have checks and if statements throughout your application to determine if that's the case. One quick thing to note is this will never work in the mainline interface just because it's a server-based variable, so that's one red flag here. But obviously, as you can see, this switch block isn't even closed here. This goes on and on for, it's obviously really hard to maintain. And what it leads to is basically things like this. Database configurations that are environment-specific, and everything is in the same code base. So this file, db.php, which some of you may recognize as a CodeIgniter database config, more specifically, it's actually Extension Engine. You can see we've got a production config, we've got local, we've got a Docker environment. Again, where there's more down below that isn't shown in the screenshot. Even you can tell, obviously this is really unmaintainable. You've got secret passwords in the code base. And also another thing to note here is the local environment. You can't even trust that to be a single environment. For example, I think there's 7 or 8 different developers that touch this particular code base. So local can mean one of 7 or 8 computers or vague installs. So that's why we've got these commented code for people that are listening on localhost versus the 127 IP. It's just really a big nightmare to maintain. So again, I'm very guilty of doing this, but we're going to try to figure out a way to avoid this in the future. Which leads me to the 12-factor app, which is a methodology for building software. You can read more about it at factor.net. Basically, it's a way to develop apps in a modern way. They're deployable across environment, portable, or scalable. And spoiler alert, 12 different factors you need to consider, and the third one is going to be store configuration in the environment. And what this allows for is separating your config from code. And the main reason we want to do this is because since config varies across deploys, and when I say deploys, I mean environments really, so like a deploy to production or deploy to staging or a deploy to local. That will vary in each environment or deploy, but the code is not really. So if you need to make a CSS change or a small, you're updating a PHP feature, just a few lines of code or change that to staging, only those few lines are going to be different between your environments. However, there's going to be so many config variables and things that are different across those environments. So one way to tell if you're violating this factor of the 12-factor app is that if you were to open source your application, would any credentials or secrets or configuration be leaked? Obviously, most closed source applications are never going to be open source, especially client projects or even personal projects. It's just generally doesn't happen very often unless there's always a goal to go open source. But it's just kind of an indicator. If you can answer this question and say yes, things would be leaked, then you're probably violating the config as code rule there, and you need to abstract that out. So the proper way that database config file should look is basically something like this. This default config is this array of attributes which are basically reading from the environment. So you see this PHP function called getEnv. This is just a built-in PHP function. It's not part of any framework or anything like that, which all it does is reads from an environment variable. And just to back up a bit, for those that don't know, an environment variable is a standard Unix system. It's basically a variable stored in the environment on that machine. It's at this operating system level. So you can read that, and actually web servers can set that, and you can read that from a PHP application. And that's exactly what this function does. So this little code block would be you'd commit to Git or whatever version control system is, and you could push that up, and everyone who works on this code base, or for every environment you're pushing to, you're just going to read from the environment, meaning all the nasty specifics about your environment are in the code. It looks a lot cleaner, so that passes the first test to me. So I'll talk a little bit about what kind of things we want to store. Obviously, passwords. I don't want to get into it, but there's other reasons why you don't want to store, just sensitive data in the code base. Basically, anyone that has access to your repo will have access to your S3 client ID and client secret, or your FTP password, or whatever it is that is sensitive. So it definitely makes sense to store that in the environment rather than the code base. Also, you want to store any external service configurations. So again, that S3 connection information, even the name of a bucket or a path or something. It's not sensitive, but it probably is going to vary between environments. Your staging environment is not going to push to a production S3 bucket. Same thing with a DB or a Redis instance or Elasticsearch or anything else. Your staging environment is not going to connect to a production DB. No, it's hope not. Another use is environment or service flag, or more specifically a feature flag. If, for example, a lot of applications have a debug flag, so if debug is to true, that means more contextual information is spit out to the user when there's an error or something. So you would want that in an environment variable. You don't want that in your code base. And also, many environments have specific directory paths. Sort of like a temp folder, for example, might be different on staging versus your local versus production. So really the key is anything going to vary between environments, you want to store an environment variable. That's when you say it like that, it makes obvious sense. But like I said, I've been very guilty of not doing this in the past. So talk about one particular PHP package, which is very, very popular and becoming more so. It's called php.env. Basically what it does is you put a .env file in the root of your project, and it reads like an INI file for those of you that are familiar with those. Basically, you can just set a number of variables, keys and values, and what this little package will do is it will load it into your PHP application as environment variables. So you don't need to mess with the server configuration. You don't need to do anything. You just have this .env file, and you store what you need to there, and then you can read it just as I showed you before. This has actually started shipping with Laravel 5, which I think is a great move. And when I was using it before then, I was very happy to see that decision was made. So for those of you that know Laravel, this will look really familiar. For those of you that don't, it's easy to add to any project. It's just a composer package you can bring in. And then with a couple lines basically telling it to load that file, in your front controller or your master config file, then you can access those variables. Using those that global function getEnv, or also it's right on the env superglobal or the server superglobal as well. I had the caveat here that everyone always said that this isn't really a production-ready PHP package. Basically, since the config from a file on every request, it's had some I/O that really isn't necessary. So if you're running your site in production, you don't want to just throw this random file that gets read on every request, because it can hurt performance. Your mileage may vary. I am definitely running a few sites in production that are not super intensive or super, critical, or having any kind of traffic or scaling issues, where just throwing a .env file in there is perfectly fine. Not seeing issues. I haven't benchmarked it. Everyone else is welcome to disagree, and I'm sure it is taking a performance hit, but in my opinion, on smaller sites, it's just really a case of over-optimization. You'd be much better served spending your time optimizing other things before something like this. But the proper way to do it is to set those environment variables in the actual web server itself. So Apache, you can do that with a set-env flag, and then PHP FPM actually has something you can do the same thing with. I just want to add a quick note about version control as well. Like I mentioned before, for secrets, you definitely don't want to store this in Git because, again, the config is not the code. These configuration items don't belong in your code base, so they don't belong in your Git repository. But obviously having version control and the fail-safes come with it, like not being able to really delete anything in Git unless you try really hard at it. You can use something called Git crypt, which you can encrypt things in your repository, which can be an like or Ansible Vault, your YAML for Puppet, which allow you to deploy these things to remote servers, but still keep them encrypted. So there are alternatives out there, but really the idea is to keep it out of version control. And that's all I got. Thank you.
All right, thanks for joining us for another Nomad PHP Lightning Talk. If you'd like to give a Lightning Talk, please email joe@nomadphp.com. Please make sure you visit Joined In and leave Ben some feedback. Thanks, Ben, for doing a Lightning Talk.